The morning mist hung like a shroud over the Ardennes forest on December 15, 1944. Private Tommy Henderson, of the 106th Infantry Division, pulled his wool coat tighter against the bitter cold as he peered through the dense pine trees. The 19-year-old from Indiana had been told this was a quiet sector, a place where green troops could get accustomed to war without facing the full fury of the German Wehrmacht. How wrong they all were across the front lines, stretching from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. 80,000 American soldiers maintained what they believed was a stable defensive position. The Ardennes had been deemed impassable by Allied intelligence, a natural barrier where Hitler would never dare launch a major offensive. The thick forests, steep ravines, and narrow winding roads seemed to offer perfect protection for the thinly stretched American line. But deep within the German lines, a different reality was taking shape. Adolf Hitler, growing increasingly desperate, as Allied forces pressed toward the German heartland, had conceived one final, audacious gamble. Operation Watch on the Rhine, later renamed Autumn Mist, represented Germany's last major offensive effort of the war. The Führer believed that if he could split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and destroy several Allied armies, he might force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, studied his maps by candlelight in a reinforced bunker 30 miles behind the front. The veteran tank commander knew the plan was ambitious beyond reason, yet he also understood that Germany had no choice but to attempt the impossible. 3 entire armies, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, his own 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army led by Erich Brandenberger, had been assembled in complete secrecy. According to historical records from the National Archives, German forces had concentrated over 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks for this offensive, representing Germany's largest remaining mobile reserve. For weeks, German units had moved only at night, their vehicles muffled, and their radio communications forbidden. Trains carrying Tiger tanks and Panther tanks rolled westward under cover of darkness. While elite Waffen-SS divisions prepared for what many believed would be their final battle, the element of surprise was crucial. Everything depended on catching the Americans. Completely off guard, Lieutenant Colonel Hurley Fuller, commanding officer of the 110th Infantry Regiment, had noticed some unusual German activity during recent patrols, but his reports were dismissed by higher command. The intelligence officers at divisional headquarters were convinced that German forces in the Ardennes were primarily composed of old men and boys, remnants of a defeated army incapable of launching any significant attack. The weather itself seemed to conspire with German plans. A massive winter storm system was approaching from the east, bringing with it the promise of heavy snow, freezing temperatures, and most importantly, thick cloud cover that would ground Allied aircraft. General Dwight Eisenhower's greatest advantage, overwhelming air superiority, would be neutralized by Mother Nature herself, as darkness fell on December 15th. German assault troops began moving into their final positions. Engineers quietly removed obstacles and prepared crossing points over the Our River and the Schur River. Artillery pieces were wheeled into carefully camouflaged positions, their crews receiving final targeting coordinates for American strongpoints. The largest German offensive since the early days of the war was mere hours away in the American lines. Most soldiers settled in for what they expected to be another quiet night in the Ardennes. Some wrote letters home, others played cards by lamplight, and many simply tried to stay warm in their foxholes. None could imagine that within hours, the entire Western Front would explode into chaos, and that their quiet sector would become the scene of one of the most desperate battles in American military history at precisely 5:30 in the morning. On December 16th, 1944, the pre-dawn silence of the Ardennes forest was shattered by the roar of 1,600 artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously. The massive barrage, unlike anything heard on the Western Front since the Normandy invasion, sent shells crashing into American positions along an 85-mile front. Trees splintered like matchsticks, Earth erupted in geysers of frozen soil, and the very ground trembled under the devastating bombardment. Private Henderson dove into his foxhole as shells screamed overhead, their distinctive whistling sound growing louder with each passing second. The young soldier pressed his face against the icy dirt as explosions rocked the forest around him. Communication lines were severed within minutes, leaving isolated American units blind and deaf to the unfolding catastrophe. The carefully orchestrated German artillery preparation was designed to achieve maximum shock and confusion, and it succeeded beyond Hitler's wildest expectations. After 90 minutes of relentless bombardment, the guns fell silent, replaced by an even more terrifying sound, the rumble of hundreds of tank engines echoing through the mist-shrouded valleys. Searchlights suddenly blazed to life, their brilliant beams cutting through the darkness and revealing the advancing German infantry. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. American defenders, many of whom had never experienced combat, found themselves facing what appeared to be an unstoppable military machine emerging from the depths of the forest. The German 6th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, struck the sector of the American line with overwhelming force. Colonel Johann Piper, leading the division's advance Kampftruppe, had been tasked with reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours. His battle group consisted of the most experienced Waffen-SS troops, supported by the newest Tiger II tanks and Panther tanks available to the German army. Military historians, as documented in the official Army Historical Series, note that Piper's battle group alone included over 5,000 men and 120 tanks, representing one of the most formidable armored spearheads assembled by Germany in the war's final year. To the south, General von Mantefel's 5th Panzer Army achieved the most dramatic early success. His forces struck the positions held by the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division, which had arrived in the Ardennes only days earlier. The division's 14th Cavalry Group, responsible for screening a front of 18 miles, was quickly overwhelmed by German armor advancing along multiple axes. Entire American companies simply vanished in the chaos, their fate unknown for days. The town of Clairvaux became the scene of desperate fighting as German forces attempted to secure the vital road network leading toward Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Fuller's 110th Infantry Regiment found itself completely surrounded, with German tanks rolling through the streets while American defenders fought from cellars and ruined buildings. The regimental headquarters, established in the town's medieval castle, became a fortress under siege. Communications throughout the American line collapsed as German infiltrators, many wearing captured American uniforms and speaking perfect English, spread confusion behind Allied lines. Operation Grief, conceived by the notorious Otto Skorzeny, deployed English-speaking German commandos to misdirect traffic, cut telephone lines, and spread false reports of German breakthroughs. The psychological warfare campaign proved remarkably effective, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that paralyzed American responses. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, received the first fragmentary reports of the German offensive while at his headquarters in Luxembourg City, initially dismissing the attack as a limited spoiling offensive. Bradley soon realized the true scope of the German assault as reports flooded in from across the Ardennes front. Entire divisions were reporting loss of contact with their subordinate units, and German armor was advancing at unprecedented speed toward strategic objectives. By noon on December 16th, German spearheads had penetrated up to 6 miles into American lines at multiple points. The town of Wiltz fell to German forces, while advance elements of the 5th Panzer Army approached the outskirts of Bastogne, the crucial road junction that controlled 7 major highways converging in the heart of the Ardennes. The American defense was crumbling faster than anyone had thought possible. The weather continued to favor German operations as heavy snow began falling, grounding Allied aircraft, and reducing visibility to mere yards in many areas. German troops, better equipped for winter warfare and operating according to carefully rehearsed plans, maintained their momentum despite increasingly difficult conditions. The Battle of the Bulge, so named because of the distinctive salient the German offensive created in Allied lines, had begun with shocking German success. The morning of December 17th dawned gray and bitter cold as German forces continued their relentless advance across the Ardennes. In the northern sector, Colonel Johann Piper's armored spearhead had achieved a stunning breakthrough. Advancing nearly 25 miles beyond the original American positions, his Tiger tanks and Panthers rolled through the villages of Hansfeld and Bullingen, crushing all resistance in their path. However, the rapid advance came at a terrible cost that would forever stain the reputation of the Waffen-SS. Near the small crossroads of Bagnes, just south of Malmedy, Piper's advance guard encountered a convoy of American vehicles from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans, who had been withdrawing from forward positions, were quickly overwhelmed and forced to surrender. What happened next would become one of the most notorious war crimes of the European theater. Approximately 120 American prisoners were herded into a snow-covered field beside the road. Without warning, German machine gunners opened fire on the unarmed captives. Those who survived the initial volley were systematically executed with pistol shots to the head. Private Homer Ford of the 285th managed to survive by playing dead beneath the bodies of his comrades, and later providing crucial testimony about what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. The news of the atrocity spread rapidly through American units, transforming the character of the battle. What had begun as a military operation now carried the bitter taste of personal revenge. American soldiers who had been willing to take German prisoners now fought with a savage intensity born of outrage and grief. The massacre became a rallying cry that stiffened American resistance throughout the Ardennes. Meanwhile, in the center of the German offensive, the strategic town of Bastogne emerged as the critical focal point of the entire battle. The crossroads. Community, population barely 4,000, controlled the road network essential to German success. Without Bastogne, Piper's spearheads would be cut off from fuel and ammunition, while the entire German advance toward Antwerp would lose its logistical foundation. According to the official history compiled by the Center of Military History, Bastogne's 7 converging roads made it the most important road junction in the Ardennes, and its capture was considered essential to German operational success. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, received emergency orders to defend Bastogne at all costs. The paratroopers, veterans of the Normandy invasion and Operation Market Garden, were rushed to the town despite being understrength and lacking winter equipment. Many soldiers wore only their standard uniforms and summer boots, woefully inadequate protection against the Arctic conditions that gripped the Ardennes. The German forces approaching Bastogne included elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, was confident that the lightly equipped American paratroopers could not withstand a determined German assault. He would soon discover the extraordinary fighting spirit of the American airborne forces as German units began encircling Bastogne. On December 18th, desperate fighting erupted in the surrounding villages. The hamlet of Nauville, just north of Bastogne, became the scene of a crucial delaying action as Team Desabry, a mixed force of paratroopers and tank destroyers, held off repeated German attacks. Major William Desabry's small command inflicted heavy casualties on advancing German armor before being forced to withdraw into Saint-Witzo's main defensive perimeter. The encirclement of Bastogne was completed on December 20th, trapping approximately 15,000 American defenders inside the town. German artillery began a systematic bombardment of the American positions, while Luttwitz prepared for a final assault. The stage was set for one of the most famous sieges in American military history, where a handful of determined soldiers would write their names in the annals of military legend. Captain John Pryor of the 3rd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, looked out over the snow-covered fields surrounding Bastogne and knew that his men faced the fight of their lives. The paratroopers had survived Normandy and Holland, but nothing had prepared them for the bitter cold and desperate conditions they now faced. Ammunition was running low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the wounded had to be treated in makeshift aid stations without adequate heat or light. Despite the overwhelming odds, morale among the American defenders remained remarkably high. The paratroopers had developed an almost mystical confidence in their ability to hold any position, and Bastogne would provide the ultimate test of that belief. As German forces tightened their grip around the besieged town, the defenders prepared for the battle that would determine the fate of the entire Ardennes offensive. December 21st brought the heaviest snowfall yet seen in the Ardennes, transforming the battlefield into a frozen wasteland where visibility dropped to mere yards and temperatures plummeted to 10 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Inside the encircled town of Bastogne, General McAuliffe's defenders huddled in foxholes carved from the frozen earth, their breath forming ice crystals in the bitter air. The American perimeter had contracted to a rough circle barely 4 miles in diameter, with German forces pressing inward from all directions. The morning silence was broken by the approach of German negotiators carrying a white flag. Under the rules of warfare, General von Luttwitz had decided to offer the Americans one final opportunity to surrender before launching his decisive assault. The German ultimatum, delivered to the American lines near the village of Remoifis, was brief and to the point: surrender honorably or face complete annihilation. When the surrender demand reached McAuliffe at his command post in the Heinz barracks, the general's response became one of the most famous utterances in American military history. After reading the German ultimatum, McAuliffe crumpled the paper and uttered a single word that perfectly captured the spirit of American resistance: nuts. His staff officers, recognizing the historical significance of the moment, convinced him to make this his formal written reply to the German demand. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, was tasked with delivering McAuliffe's response to the waiting German negotiators. When the puzzled German officers asked for clarification of the American slang term, Harper provided a more explicit translation that left no doubt about American intentions. The siege of Bastogne would continue, and both sides prepared for the bloodiest fighting yet seen in the Ardennes. The McAuliffe Papers, housed at the Army Heritage and Education Center, document that the general's famous response was spontaneous and reflected his frustration with German demands that he considered unreasonable given his force's capability to continue resistance. The German assault on Bastogne began in earnest on December 22nd, with artillery barrages followed by coordinated infantry and armor attacks against the American perimeter. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Regiment struck the eastern approaches while the 77th Grenadier Regiment attacked from the southeast. German commanders were confident that the undermanned American position would collapse within hours under sustained pressure. They had not reckoned with the extraordinary determination of the American paratroopers. The defenders, many of whom were fighting with weapons scavenged from German casualties, repelled every assault with devastating effectiveness. Sergeant Leighton Black of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment single-handedly destroyed 2 German tanks with bazookas, while Private Carl Cartledge held a critical section of the perimeter despite being wounded 3 times. The most desperate fighting occurred around the village of Champs, where elements of the 327th Glider Infantry faced repeated German attacks supported by Panzer for tanks. Lieutenant Colonel Ray Allen's battalion was forced to give ground, but conducted a fighting withdrawal that inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Germans. Every house became a fortress, every street corner a killing ground where American defenders exacted a terrible price for every yard of territory. Supply became the critical factor, determining Bastogne's fate. The surrounded Americans were running dangerously low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. More critically, they faced a severe shortage of artillery shells, the weapon system that had proven most effective against German armor attacks. Without resupply, even the most determined defenders could not hold their positions indefinitely against overwhelming German superiority in men and equipment. On December 23rd, the weather began to clear for the first time since the German offensive began. Allied pilots, grounded for a week by the severe winter storm, finally had the opportunity to provide desperately needed support to the besieged garrison. The first C-47 transport aircraft appeared over Bastogne at mid-morning, their engines music To the ears of the embattled defenders below, the aerial resupply operation, designated Operation Repulse, faced enormous challenges. German anti-aircraft guns surrounded Bastogne, while Luftwaffe fighters prowled the skies seeking to intercept the lumbering transport planes. Despite these dangers, American and British pilots pressed home their supply runs with remarkable courage, dropping bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, and food directly into the shrinking American perimeter. Captain Willis McKee, piloting a C-47 from the 436th Troop Carrier Group, made 3 separate runs over Bastogne despite heavy German fire. His aircraft was riddled with bullet holes and shrapnel, but McKee continued flying until his cargo was delivered. The courage of the transport crews provided the margin of survival that allowed Bastogne's defenders to continue their resistance. As night fell on December 23rd, both sides prepared for what many believed would be the final phase of the siege. German forces had been reinforced with additional armor and artillery, while the American defenders had received enough supplies to continue fighting for several more days. The battle for Bastogne had become a test of will between two of the finest military forces in the world. With the outcome still hanging in the balance, General George Smith Patton Jr. paced the floor of his Third Army, headquarters in Nancy, France, like a caged lion sensing prey. The flamboyant commander, whose ivory-handled pistols and profanity-laced speeches had made him a legend throughout the American forces, studied the situation maps with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a crucial move. The German offensive in the Ardennes had created exactly the kind of fluid, fast-moving battle that suited Patton's aggressive temperament perfectly. On December 19th, Patton had made what many military historians consider one of the most remarkable command decisions of the Second World War. Meeting with General Bradley and Supreme Commander Eisenhower at Verdun, Patton calmly announced that he could pivot his entire Third Army 90 degrees northward and attack the southern flank of the German salient within 72 hours. Most officers present considered such a maneuver impossible, but Patton had already begun the complex staff work necessary to execute this audacious plan. The challenge facing Patton was enormous by any military standard. Moving an entire army, over 250,000 men with all their vehicles, artillery, and supplies, across difficult terrain in the middle of winter while maintaining combat effectiveness, required logistics coordination of unprecedented complexity. Roads had to be cleared, fuel supplies repositioned, and communication networks established, all while German forces continued their advance toward strategic objectives. Major General John Milliken's Third Corps spearheaded Patton's relief effort, with the 4th Armored Division leading the advance toward Bastogne. The division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, had earned a reputation as one of the most effective armored formations in the European theater. Their Sherman tanks and tank destroyers began the difficult advance through the snow-covered hills south of the besieged town on December 22nd. According to the Third Army's official operational reports, archived at the National Archives, Patton's forces covered over 100 miles in less than 48 hours, while transitioning from defensive positions to full offensive operations. A logistical achievement considered nearly impossible. By contemporary military doctrine, the German forces blocking Patton's advance were far from the demoralized remnants that Allied intelligence had predicted. The 5th Parachute Division, commanded by Colonel Ludwig Heilmann, had established strong defensive positions in the villages of Essenois and Sibret. These elite troops, veterans of campaigns from Crete to Normandy, were determined to prevent American relief forces from reaching Bastogne at any cost. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, led the spearhead advance with characteristic aggressiveness. The future Army Chief of Staff had already established himself as one of America's finest tank commanders, and the relief of Bastogne would add another chapter to his growing legend. His Sherman tanks, supported by armored infantry and artillery, began the methodical process of breaking through German defensive lines. The fighting for each village became a separate battle, with German paratroopers defending every building with fanatical determination. The hamlet of Chaumont fell only after house-to-house fighting that lasted 6 hours, while the village of New Chateau required a coordinated assault by an entire combat command. German anti-tank guns, skillfully concealed in stone buildings and farm structures, took a heavy toll on advancing American armor. Combat Command Reserve, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Jaques, approached Bastogne from the southwest while combat. Command Alpha advanced from the southeast. The two-pronged attack was designed to split German forces and create multiple breakthrough opportunities. However, the terrain heavily favored the defenders, with narrow roads flanked by dense forests, providing ideal conditions for anti-tank ambushes. On December 26th, elements of the 37th Tank Battalion finally established contact with Bastogne's defenders near the village of Esseneux. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead Sherman tank, spotted American positions and radioed the historic message, "Come on out, this is the 4th Armored." The siege of Bastogne was officially broken, though fighting continued for control of the supply corridor. The relief of Bastogne marked a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. But the victory came at enormous cost. The 4th Armored Division suffered over 1,000 casualties during the relief operation, while German forces continued to contest every mile of the narrow corridor connecting Bastogne to American lines. The town remained under artillery bombardment, and German forces maintained positions that threatened to cut the supply route at any moment. General McAuliffe greeted his rescuers with characteristic understatement, simply noting that his men were glad to see the relief forces. However, the psychological impact of breaking the siege resonated throughout both armies. American morale soared, while German confidence in achieving their objectives began to waver. The impregnable fortress of Bastogne had held against overwhelming odds, proving that American forces could match German military prowess under the most adverse conditions. The relief of Bastogne also demonstrated the remarkable flexibility and professionalism of American military leadership. Patton's ability to redirect his entire army within days, combined with the tactical skill of subordinate commanders like Abrams and the extraordinary courage of individual soldiers, had achieved what many considered impossible. The tide of battle in the Ardennes was beginning to turn, though the heaviest fighting still lay ahead. By December 27th, 1944, the character of the Battle of the Bulge had fundamentally changed. What began as a German offensive designed to split Allied forces and capture Antwerp had degenerated into a desperate struggle for survival as German spearheads found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The weather, which had initially favored German operations by grounding Allied aircraft, now turned decisively against Hitler's last gamble. Colonel Johann Peiper's once mighty Kampftruppe, the spearhead of the German offensive, had advanced farther west than any other German unit, reaching the town of Stoumont before being halted by determined American resistance. The 30th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Leland Hobbs, had fought a series of delaying actions that prevented Peiper from reaching his ultimate objective, the vital fuel dumps near Spa, that could have sustained the German advance to the Meuse River. Peiper's situation had become increasingly desperate as American forces closed in from multiple directions. His fuel supplies were nearly exhausted, ammunition was running critically low, and his route back to German lines was threatened by advancing American units. The elite Waffen-SS troops, who had terrorized Allied forces during the first days of the offensive, now found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket with no hope of relief or resupply. The turning point came during the action at Stoumont on December 19th and 20th, where elements of the 30th Infantry Division's 119th Infantry Regiment fought a desperate battle to prevent German forces from reaching the fuel depot at Francorchamps. Private First Class Francis Curry single-handedly destroyed several German positions during the fighting, actions that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. Military records from the First Army archives document that German forces came within 4 miles of capturing over 2.5 million gallons of fuel stored at Spa, supplies that could have sustained their advance to Antwerp and potentially changed the outcome of the entire offensive to the south. General von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army had achieved the deepest penetration of American lines, with advance elements reaching cells less than 4 miles from the Meuse River, however. These spearheads had outrun their supply lines and found themselves facing fresh American forces rushing to contain the German breakthrough. The 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, had been rushed from reserve positions to block further German advances. The German offensive had created a salient nearly 60 miles deep and 25 miles wide. But this apparent success masked fundamental weaknesses in the German position. The narrow corridor connecting advancing German forces to their supply bases was vulnerable to Allied counterattacks. While German units were scattered across a front too wide for effective coordination, Hitler's insistence on continuing the offensive despite mounting losses had placed his armies in an increasingly precarious position. American forces were finally receiving the reinforcements and supplies necessary to launch effective counteroffensives. The 82nd Airborne Division, BUSH, from England under the command of Brigadier General James Gavin, took up positions in the northern sector of the German salient. The veteran paratroopers, supported by elements of the British 30th Corps, began applying pressure against German forces that had advanced beyond their ability to maintain defensive positions. The air situation changed dramatically as clearing weather allowed Allied aircraft to resume operations on a massive scale. The 9th Air Force launched Operation Clarion, a coordinated campaign designed to destroy German supply lines and communication networks supporting the Ardennes offensive. Fighter bombers ranged across the German rear areas, attacking everything that moved, while heavy bombers struck transportation hubs and fuel depots. German forces, which had enjoyed freedom of movement during the early days of the offensive, now faced constant harassment from Allied aircraft. Daylight movement became virtually impossible as P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs prowled the skies, attacking any German vehicles bold enough to venture onto the roads. The Luftwaffe, which had managed to achieve temporary air superiority during the opening phases of the battle, found itself overwhelmed by superior Allied numbers and began suffering unsustainable losses. The psychological impact of the changing military situation was profound on both sides. German troops, who had begun the offensive with high morale and confidence in ultimate victory, now faced the reality that their last major gamble was failing. Units that had advanced with lightning speed during the first week of the offensive now found themselves trapped in defensive positions, fighting desperately to avoid encirclement and destruction. Conversely, American morale soared as news of the relief of Bastogne and successful defensive actions spread throughout the Allied forces. The initial shock and confusion of the German surprise attack had given way to grim determination and professional competence. American commanders had learned valuable lessons about German tactical capabilities and were applying those lessons with devastating effectiveness. By the end of December, it was clear that Germany's last offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Antwerp remained firmly in Allied hands. The Western Front had not collapsed, and German reserves committed to the Ardennes would not be available to defend against the inevitable Allied offensive into Germany itself. The question was no longer whether Germany could win the Battle of the Bulge, but whether German forces could escape the trap they had created for themselves in the Ardennes forest. The first day of January, 1945, dawned cold and clear across the Ardennes battlefield, revealing the full extent of German vulnerability to Allied commanders who had spent 2 weeks fighting in fog and snow. The massive salient created by Hitler's offensive now appeared as what military strategists call a target of opportunity, a concentration of enemy forces vulnerable to coordinated attack from multiple directions. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, began planning the counteroffensive that would eliminate the German Bulge once and for all. Operation Cobra II, as the Allied counteroffensive was designated, represented a dramatic reversal of fortune from the desperate defensive battles of mid-December. Now, it was American and British forces who possessed the initiative, while German units found themselves fighting for survival in an increasingly untenable position. The hunter had become the hunted, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. German retreat began on January 3rd with General von Manteuffel's decision to abandon the advanced positions near Celles. The 5th Panzer Army, which had come closest to achieving German objectives, now faced encirclement by converging Allied forces. American artillery, positioned on the high ground surrounding the German salient, could bring devastating fire to bear on any German movement, turning the withdrawal into a running battle through the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Colonel Piper's Kampfgruppe, surrounded near Stoumont since late December, made a desperate attempt to break through American lines on January 4th. Survivors of what had once been Germany's most elite armored spearhead abandoned their remaining vehicles and attempted to escape on foot through the dense forest. Of the original 5,000 men who had begun the offensive, fewer than 800 reached German lines, and virtually all of their heavy equipment was left behind as testament to American defensive prowess, according to the after-action reports compiled by the 1st Army Historical Section. German forces abandoned over 300 tanks and assault guns during their retreat from the Ardennes, equipment that represented a significant portion of Germany's remaining armored reserves. The town of Huffelise, located at the base of the German salient, became the focal point of the Allied counteroffensive. General Patton's Third Army attacked northward, while General Courtney Hodges' First Army pressed southward, seeking to trap the remaining German forces in a classic pincer movement. The two American armies made contact on January 16th, effectively sealing the fate of German units still trapped within the shrinking pocket. Throughout the German retreat, individual acts of heroism on both sides provided stark contrasts to the larger strategic failure of Hitler's last gamble. Technical Sergeant Vernon McGarty of the 393rd Infantry Regiment earned the Medal of Honor for single-handedly destroying multiple German positions during the fighting near Krinkelt, while German paratroopers continued to fight with desperate courage despite the hopelessness of their situation. The final phase of the Battle of the Bulge was characterized by pursuit operations as Allied forces sought to prevent German units from establishing new defensive positions. The retreating Germans conducted a skillful rearguard action, utilizing the difficult terrain to slow Allied advances while extracting as many men and as much equipment as possible. However, the German army that emerged from the Ardennes bore no resemblance to the confident force that had launched the offensive for weeks earlier. By January 28th, Allied forces had restored the original front lines that existed before the German offensive began. The Bulge and Allied lines had been eliminated, but at enormous cost to both sides. American casualties totaled approximately 81,000 men, including 19,000 killed in action, making the battle of the Bulge the costliest engagement in American military history. German losses were even more severe, with over 100,000 casualties and the virtual destruction of the strategic reserves that Hitler had hoped to use for the defense of Germany itself. The battle's impact extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The successful defense of Bastogne became a symbol of American determination and fighting spirit. While the failure of Hitler's last offensive convinced many Germans that the war was truly lost, the propaganda value of the American victory resonated throughout occupied Europe, strengthening resistance movements and reinforcing Allied determination to achieve unconditional German surrender. For the individual soldiers who fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge represented the ultimate test of their courage, endurance, and professional competence. Men like Private Henderson, who had entered the battle as inexperienced recruits, emerged as veterans hardened by combat and proven under the most adverse conditions. The American army that emerged from the Ardennes was a far more capable fighting force than the one that had been surprised by Hitler's desperate gamble. The strategic consequences of the German defeat were profound and irreversible. Hitler had committed his last significant reserves to an offensive that achieved none of its objectives while consuming resources that could have been used to defend Germany against the impending Allied invasion. The failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, assuring that the war in Europe would conclude with complete Allied victory rather than the negotiated settlement that Hitler had desperately sought. As February dawned over the battlefield, where so many had fought and died, the Ardennes forest began to show the first signs of spring's approach. The snow that had played such a crucial role in the battle's early phases gradually gave way to mud and slush, revealing the debris of Hitler's failed gamble scattered across the forest floor. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its legacy would endure as one of the finest hours in American military history. A testament to the courage and determination of ordinary soldiers faced with extraordinary challenges.